While 1983 would have fewer stone-cold classics, it was still quite a fun year for horror. 1983 would be the year of swatches and GoBots. It would be the year that the moonwalk was introduced, and Ray-Ban sunglasses would explode in popularity due to the Tom Cruise movie Risky Business. 1983 saw the United States invade Grenada, while a show called Fraggle Rock would be one of New Network HBO's first original programs. We would have the introduction to two plumbers named Mario and Luigi right as the video game landscape was seeing a crash. Finally, John Landis, Vincent Price, and Michael Jackson would give the world an anthem for horror with a nearly 14-minute long music video entitled Thriller. And speaking of music and horror, one of the top songs of the year would be inspired by a news report of a serial killer and would take its name from a rather grisly horror film, 1980's Maniac. The lyrics were originally violent, but its catchy beat and chorus would catch the ear of director Adrian Lyne for his new film Flashdance. It would be rewritten for obvious reasons, so next time you hear how she's dancing like she's never danced before, just know that it was first,
"He's a maniac, that's for sure. He'll kill your cat and nail it to the door."
While there would be a couple of big ones, 1983 would not be the year of the slasher, but instead a time for experimentation. It would be a year for solid directors to sometimes have multiple films. It was also very much the year of Stephen King.
From the novel by Stephen King comes a startling vision of fear.
Please, God, get me out of here.
Well, the weird thing is I've seen the movie multiple times. I've read the book once. Got the hardcover right when it came out. Got it for Christmas.
Stephen King is no stranger to adaptations of his work. It was shown that his work could be bankable and award-worthy right from the onset with 1976's Carrie, which was directed by Brian De Palma with a script by Lawrence D. Cohen. Not only did it break the bank financially with its $33 million box office off of only a $1.8 million budget, but it was one of the few horror movies to make noise during awards season. While it's not uncommon for there to be one King adaptation every 3 months in every given year now, post-Carrie we would only see about one per year. 1983 was the first year that showed what type of draw he could be, with 3 movies all hitting theaters within 5 months of each other. And you know what? All 3 were successful.
In the fact that he is still relevant now, and I'm still buying his books now and still being scared by his books and his son's books. So that guy is creating an entire legacy of just horror writers and books and novels and spin-off movies.
Now there's a new name for terror. Cujo.
The first of the triple threat would be Cujo, released on August 12, 1983. It was directed by Louis Teague and starred Dee Wallace as the frightened mother trying to desperately protect her and her son from a giant, rabid Saint Bernard. Cujo wasn't always rabid, and he wasn't always a life-threatening beast either. He gets bit on the nose and the disease slowly takes hold, while Dee Wallace's housewife character Donna and her son Tad are getting their car fixed. Vic, Donna's husband and Tad's father, leaves and Cujo changes. He kills the neighbor and eventually a policeman, while Donna and her son hide in a car. Fears of dehydration and heat stroke set in, so Donna decides to take action. In a tense series of moments, she is able to fight off Cujo multiple times and saves her son while also reuniting with her ad executive husband. Cujo looks incredibly menacing in the movie, but the dogs portraying the monster were almost too nice on set. Cujo would pull in $21 million on its $6 million budget, even with its mixed reviews from critics. Dee Wallace would continue her genre appeal to modern day with multiple Rob Zombie movie roles amongst other recent films. Director Louis Teague would be tapped for another King movie 2 years later with the Drew Barrymore-led anthology Cat's Eye, but also direct fan favorites Jewel of the Nile and Navy SEALs.
Ooh, Navy SEALs!
Like most Stephen King adaptations, it hasn't received the remake treatment yet. Still, the project has been floating around since 2015. and there's always a chance that a studio could want a reimagining, perhaps more in line with the much darker novel over 40 years later.
Stephen King, The Dead Zone.
The second of 1983's triple King feature would be in the form of The Dead Zone. It would be released on October 21st and be directed by genre favorite David Cronenberg.
I'm a huge fan of David Cronenberg. I love body horror in general, and I think that his movies really push the boundaries of like what the human body can be, because there's nothing more frightening than when, if you get sick and your body starts doing things that you can't control, you're just a passenger in the vessel.
While Dee Wallace would carry most of the load acting-wise in Cujo, The Dead Zone is stuffed with heavy-hitting acting talent. Christopher Walken leads and has a supporting cast that includes Tom Skerritt, Martin Sheen, and Brooke Adams. John Carpenter collaborator and frequent creative partner Deborah Hill even produced it. The story follows Johnny Smith, played by Walken, who gets in a car accident and falls into a coma for 5 years. After he awakens, he finds out that he has the ability to see into a person's past, present, and future through the act of physical touch. This gift is scary at first because he has no control over it, or what he sees, and the girlfriend he loved has moved on in the 5 years since, leaving him alone and confused. Eventually, he got back to almost what he was physically, and he uses his new gift to help a sheriff with a series of murders that he can't solve. He eventually agrees, and while he helps solve the crimes, it comes at a cost. He finds out that one of the sheriff's own deputies is the murderer, but before they can arrest him, he kills himself. This causes the deputy's mother to shoot Johnny before she too is killed. He was able to solve the crime, but at what cost? He moves to another town to try and start a new life, but his visions continue to make everyday life impossible. He decides to tutor children as he was an English teacher before his accident. But he is still unable to shake his curse. He sees 3 boys dying by drowning and tries to get the family to change their plans, but 2 of the boys end up dying still. It's here where he discovers a dead zone in his abilities, where sometimes there's just no way to prevent what he sees. He meets a presidential hopeful played by Martin Sheen at a rally where his ex-love and her husband frequent, and sees horrifying visions of this man in office starting World War III by sending a nuclear strike to Russia. Torn between what to do with that information after everything that he has experienced with his gift, he seeks the advice of his doctor, who says he would do everything in his power to prevent something so evil from happening. He does, but dies in the process. Thankfully, his actions show what kind of man the presidential candidate is, and he takes his own life.
And I love that movie, not just because it's sort of very aesthetic and very precise and very simple, but that it goes there at the end.
A decidedly less happy ending than that of Cujo, but with great performances, especially by Christopher Walken. While he would later parody the same character on Saturday Night Live, with the catch being that he sees banal occurrences in people's futures instead of life-threatening ones.
Look, you don't get it, do you? You're wasting coffee!
First off, we should do an entire interview series just on Christopher Walken performances and how fucking creepy that guy is, from the Dead Zone to Communion on to whatever else.
Walken almost wasn't cast in the first place. The movie wouldn't make quite as much as Cujo, with its higher budget being closer to $10 million and its box office being closer to $20 million. But it had higher review scores than its big cuddly dog counterpart. Unlike Cujo, the property would have a life of its own in multiple ways, with it being the first novel of King's to take place in his all-encompassing town of Castle Rock. And the property would get a show starring Anthony Michael Hall in the lead role that would last a whopping 6 seasons. As for Cronenberg, this would be one of his 2 movies this year to get released, alongside Videodrome starring James Woods.
That's a movie that is one of my favorites because it is so prescient. Like there's a whole sequence where someone has what is right now is a virtual reality helmet. And this was '83. Like, this is a virtual reality helmet, and they're trying to record someone's dreams and what he can see through the helmet. There's so much going on, how media impacts and how the amount of charged material you receive. Does it change your brain? What if it did change your brain? What if a gland was formed with the Videodrome signal? There's so much going on in how communications and media impacts culture and vice versa in that movie that it has the darkest ending ever. The darkest ending of a studio release ever. I can understand why it was a complete flop when it came out, but if you really want to challenge yourself intellectually and emotionally, you go watch Videodrome. It will knock your socks off.
Christine. Body by Plymouth. Soul by Satan.
My father was a huge Stephen King fan, and he read all of Stephen King's books. And so Christine, believe it or not, was the first, the Bachman books was the first Stephen King book that I ever read, but then I read Christine. And so I think Christine might have been the first movie that I saw in a book that I actually read.
The third movie on the Masters of Horror tour would be Christine. This would release all the way at the end of the year on December 9th. Another Stephen King film and another star director. John Carpenter would follow in the steps of Brian De Palma, George Romero, Tobe Hooper, and Stanley Kubrick with his turn at a King property. This would be his first and only shot, as he would be replaced on the following year's Firestarter with Mark L. Lester before principal photography even started. Christine would be a deviation from Carpenter's normal fare, with hardly any of his regulars involved. Apart from Alan Howarth helping out with the music department, and Harry Dean Stanton being featured in a role 2 years after Escape from New York, there isn't anything else that would suggest that this is a Carpenter movie. It was a big studio film. King was so hot at the time that the movie was put into production before the book was even released to the public. The movie starts with the creation of a demon car in 1957, before jumping ahead to the late 70s, where perpetual nerd Arnold Cunningham buys the car from a junkyard, and as he works on the vehicle, Arnold begins to change. He sheds his nerdy persona and starts becoming arrogant and too cool for school. Literally, as his grades begin to suffer, the local gang starts to pick on him. Tell me if you've heard that one before in a Stephen King story. And he begins dating a new student. The car gets simultaneously jealous of Arnold's girlfriend, but also protective of its new driver.
You feel the love story between Christine and Keith Gordon's character. You feel that relationship. Carpenter does an excellent job of capturing that, and that's I think less there in the book.
And after the gang messes with the car, they all die alone one by one in gruesome ways. In one of the great scenes of the 80s, Christine chases after one of the gang members entirely on fire.
It has some landmark terrifying stuff in it. You know, that car on fire, chasing the guy down the street is, and you feel the personality of the car right from the beginning, you know, with the George Thorogood version of Bad to the Bone. It's fantastic. It sets the tone immediately of what that movie is.
The car is determined to take its vengeance, and is able to self-repair after the acts are done, you know, to hide the evidence. Arnold dies while still fully obsessed with Christine, but his friends can destroy the possessed car and crush it into a cube. This being the 80s and all, the car twitches at the very end, perhaps leaving the door open for a sequel that would never come.
What he did with Cujo is he said, hey, dogs can be scary. Cars can be scary, and something that you possess or that that you own can own you was a concept that I never, I guess, thought of. And someone's obsession with an item and how that can be dangerous and how the item can eventually control you and own you.
Similar to Cujo, the critics would be split on the film's merits, but the public came out to support it, and it made $21 million on its $10 million budget. While the young cast does a great job with their characters, we almost got a big star in the title role before he decided to go dancing in a small town. While there was certainly one undisputed king who sat on the horror cinema throne in 1983, the rest of the year had a wondrous assortment of both treasure and trash for horror hounds to sink their teeth into. While you may not be able to name as many hits off the top of your head as other years throughout the decade, a search of what was released yields memorable genre work that were not only staples of video stores everywhere, but benchmarks that were handed down from sibling to sibling, parent to child, or discovered on our own. Video stores, late night cable, and even taking a chance at the movie theater could lead down several roads in 1983. And that's not even mentioning some of the bigger entries to spotlight the year. While it might seem like a bit of an odd duck at first, 1983 gave us some truly memorable movies to browse through and should be explored in its entirety to have the full effect.
Jaws 3D. The third dimension is terror.
And that's one thing that I think the 80s captured. There was a ridiculous, over-the-top nature to the horror.
1983 was, in some ways, a great year for movie-going audiences. You had the De Palma classic Scarface, sci-fi behemoth Return of the Jedi, comedies like National Lampoon's Vacation and Trading Places, plus Tom Cruise's coming-of-age drama Risky Business. Matthew Broderick attempted to start World War III, albeit inadvertently, in War Games, and fantasy epic Krull was good old-fashioned fun, while we were also treated to some horror gems in Tony Scott's The Hunger and Cronenberg's Videodrome. Plus, you know, there was Cujo and The Dead Zone. That's arguably not a bad return on your hard-earned cinema-going bucks. And while there were other notable theatrical gems too long to list in this particular video, one of the most anticipated movies was first-time director Joe Alvez's Jaws 3. The original movie is a bona fide classic that saw a young Spielberg at the very top of his game, so early in his directorial career. And while Jaws 2 doesn't live up to the first film, it still delivered enough scares and thrills to satiate fans. And it had just enough bite, you could say, and also brought back key members of the first film's cast to boot. However, it did manage to shoehorn some fairly ridiculous but fun action into the mix. 1975's Jaws was one of the first horror movies that I had the pleasure of seeing at a fairly young age. Again, due to the cunning on my part, and my parents having a bit of a liberal attitude to what their kids watched. Well, I mean, apart from the time that they banned me from going to see Rocky IV at my local cinema as it was apparently too violent. So you let me watch people being eaten by a huge great white shark, but not two buffed up dudes pretending to hit each other? That's parenting 101 right there, folks. Jaws 3 left a lasting impression on me, and not because it was a great movie. No, far from it. But it was one of those cinema-going experiences that stayed with me for more nostalgic reasons. Back then, theaters were jam-packed on opening weekend, and sometimes the weeks afterwards, especially for what were generally regarded as tentpole films back then. Jaws 3, with its, if you believe the playground rumors, amazing 3D effects, was one of those movies. All we had to go on was a grainy trailer and that aforementioned word of mouth, so anticipation was at a fever pitch going into the film. However, before we get into the gory details of Jaws 3D itself, it's worth revisiting the film's production, as it turned out to be just as tortured as getting a mechanical shark to behave for Spielberg and his crew on the first movie. The idea for the Shark threequel was originally pitched by the producers of the first two movies, David Brown and Richard Zanuck, as a spoof called Jaws 3 People Zero. However, there was just one snag in this cunning plan. Universal Pictures. The studio hated the idea of making the movie a spoof. Had they not seen Airplane?
I'll take care of this. Calm down. Calm down. Get a hold of yourself.
Doctor, you're wanted on the phone.
Executive producer David Brown summed up Universal's attitude about making the movie a spoof as fouling in your own nest. We should have fouled the nest. It would have been golden, maybe even platinum. Again, hindsight is a wonderful thing, but would the movie have been any better if it had went down that particular route? Maybe, but we will never know, and the movie itself is almost like a Sharknado flick anyway, just without the knowing self-awareness. Ultimately, writer, producer, and director Alan Landsberg bought the rights to produce the film, and initially approached experimental filmmaker Murray Lerner, who already had experience in the 3D format with his 1978 film Sea Dream. However, once he saw the script, Lerner described how his heart sank at the prospect of becoming involved, and bailed just as quickly as he was first approached. In the end, first-time director Joe Alves agreed to helm the project, after working as production designer on the first two movies, and also as the second unit director on Jaws 2. However, despite the production having its main man in place behind the camera, the writing process was typically complicated for what Universal were hoping would be a successful continuation of one of their key movie franchises. Several writers were involved, including Richard Matheson, who had previously written the script for Spielberg's 1971 television movie, Duel, and who, in his own words, claims to have written a very interesting outline for the story, despite it ultimately being credited to someone else. One issue was that Universal were forcing Matheson to include Chief Brody's two sons in the narrative, which the writer thought was dumb, especially considering that the studio also wanted the shark in the movie to be the same one that was electrocuted in Jaws 2. As the following quote attests, the writer was less than impressed with the final cut of the film. "I'm a good storyteller, and I wrote a good outline and a good script, and if they had done it right, and if it had been directed by somebody who knew how to direct, I think it would have been an excellent movie. Jaws 3D was the only thing Joe Alves ever directed. The man is a very skilled production designer, but as a director, no. And the so-called 3D just made the film look murky. It had no effect whatsoever. It was a waste of time."
The industry has always tried to been a little risk adverse, so it really comes down to the sensibility of that director, that writer, that producer, to make a film, and it's always an uphill fight, to do it. But I think that you get something that's a lot more exciting when you're doing something that people haven't seen before, as opposed to the same thing they've seen before.
A seemingly harsh summary, but fairly accurate to be sure. In perhaps a surprising and arguably bold move, Jaws 3 did not bring back any of the cast from the first two films. So gone were the legendary Roy Scheider as well as his on-screen wife played by Lorraine Gary. In fact, Universal had no option to bring back Scheider to play Police Chief Martin Brody again, as the actor made it very clear that he would not be interested in the project, stating that Mephistopheles couldn't talk me into doing it. They knew better than to even ask. To be extra certain of having no involvement in the movie, Scheider agreed to do the 1983 movie Blue Thunder instead, which turned out to be a very smart move, as that movie is pretty decent. Well played, sir. Well played indeed. So with the mostly lack of legacy characters, the slate was clean for the writers and producers to introduce a new smorgasbord of shark bait for the threequel. The most high-profile casting was Dennis Quaid, who was cast to play Mike Brody, son of Chief Brody from the first two films. Joining Quaid was newcomer and future mother of Marty McFly, Leah Thompson. Then there was Bess Strong, Simon McCorkindale, and Louis Gossett Jr. The cast overall was quite strong, but the most interesting tale from the production was Dennis Quaid's admission in an interview with Esquire from 2015 that he was high on cocaine in every single frame of the movie. He claims that he was at the height of his drug use while filming this, and would apparently stage fights with crew members during production to freak out the rest of the cast. If approached regarding the movie nowadays, his response is, "I was in Jaws what?"
Got Gotcha!
We've established that Jaws 3 had quite the eventful inception, and that certain members of the cast may have been high on cocaine for the duration of the shoot.
You know, back in the 80s, they didn't give a fuck. They would just make the most ridiculous, drug-addicted, ridiculous fucking plastic monster bullshit, and it was awesome, and they were fun.
But what about the quality of the movie itself? Is it really as bad as quite a few people have said in the past? Or were my school friends correct in their hasty proclamations of it having the best 3D you have ever seen? The original movie is such an all-time classic that, after multiple rewatches, you can still find something new or hidden away to marvel at. No, unfortunately, the much maligned Jaws 3 is mildly entertaining, but largely toothless monster movie that acts more like an elongated advertisement for SeaWorld with some shoddy visual effects added in. The plot sees Dennis Quaid's Mike Brody, son of Chief Brody from the first film, now working for SeaWorld alongside his brother Sean. Now, you perhaps would have thought that childhood trauma involving man-eating sea creatures would put a person off from working at a place such as SeaWorld, but we'll suspend our disbelief at this point. Anyway, SeaWorld is gearing up to open its brand new state-of-the-art undersea kingdom that has a series of gates that are accessible to the ocean. When one of the gates inevitably malfunctions, a cheeky young great white shark sneaks in and ultimately dies in the tank it's placed in. Then, despite great whites generally not giving a flying about their offspring the moment they are born, Mama Shark goes into full-on berserker mode, and all bets are off. The 3D elements of the movie are simply left as a series of lackluster scenes in 2D, with severed arms and other things poking towards the camera for no apparent reason. My hazy recollections of the 3D from that theatrical experience all those years ago did make me realize watching it again back in the early 80s that the 3D was probably fun, if albeit a throwaway aspect of the film. The opening shot, for example, where an unseen shark bites the head off a fish and then floats awkwardly in the frame for what feels like an eternity, it was probably quite cool and morbidly humorous in 3D. But the desperate lingering on the severed head is a clear sign of the lack of real quality behind the camera on this threequel. Even the cast can't quite save the movie. Dennis Quaid seems entirely disinterested in his role and allegedly high as a kite, while his love interest, played by Bess Armstrong, has no way of sparking any real chemistry with her co-star. Only the great, if strangely cast and underutilized, Lou Gossett Jr. attempts to fill scenes with the required gravitas and earned delivery required to carry a movie such as Jaws 3. Gossett Jr. had just won the Best Supporting Actor Oscar for An Officer and a Gentleman before he took on the role as the mastermind behind the Watery Amusement Park. So it's a shame his role didn't have a more dramatic arc.
$2.5 million turbine that's not going to go up in smoke because of some damn fish. Now shut the pumps down.
Overall, the movie is ridiculous but fun. If you discount it as part of a potentially great franchise, with an amazing first movie and pretty decent second one, if only it had lived up to its marketing tagline, "The third dimension is terror." Despite Jaws 3 not exactly being the critical success that Universal may have been hoping for, it still managed to pull in a respectable total of $45 million worldwide, which was the highest for a 3D movie for some time in the 80s. This led to the inevitable continuation of the franchise, and before too long, audiences were treated to the unintentionally hilarious Jaws: The Revenge in 1987. Legendary English actor Michael Caine was somehow persuaded to join the cast of the fourth movie, and he at least plays his role with gusto throughout. Plus, we get ample use of John Williams' score in the movie to offset what is easily the worst entry in the franchise.
Sleepaway Camp. You won't be coming home.
I remember, again, going back to VHSs, pausing because I was like, there's no way I'm seeing this.
Horror has long been seen as a stepping stone genre. A lot of filmmakers make their feature debut with a low-budget horror movie, the idea being that there will be a good return on investment, thus opening the door for them to be able to follow it up with something even bigger. This approach to breaking into the film industry has resulted in some massive success stories. Sam Raimi went from The Evil Dead to Spider-Man, Peter Jackson went from Bad Taste to The Lord of the Rings, James Wan went from Saw to Fast and Furious 7. Robert Hiltzik didn't have the same sort of career trajectory as those guys did, but he got started in very much the same way. He was a grad student at NYU with dreams of getting into filmmaking when he had the idea for Sleepaway Camp. He wanted to make something that would be inexpensive, easy to market, and would take place primarily in just one location. So making a campground slasher was the obvious choice, especially since he had grown up going to a summer camp called Camp Algonquin in Argyle, New York. He had admitted that horror movies aren't his top choice when it comes to going out to watch a movie, but horror was the most promising way to get his directing career started. A lot of slashers begin with a scene set years before the events that follow, and Sleepaway Camp is no different. Hiltzik had the opening scene of the film in mind from the start. We see a man hanging out on a lake with his young children, a son and a daughter. Then their peaceful afternoon takes a nightmarish turn when some dim-witted teens in a speedboat crash into the family. It's tragic. It's disturbing. It's a great way to get a horror movie started. Hiltzik also knew exactly how he was going to end the movie. He just had to fill out what was going to happen between those two scenes. 8 years after the boating accident, we find the father's surviving child has been taken in by their Aunt Martha, a woman who is apparently a doctor even though she appears to have some serious mental issues. Martha sends her son Ricky and his cousin Angela off to camp, after making them promise not to tell anyone how they got the results of their physical exams. That's odd, but we'll move right along and discover that camp life is not all that pleasant. Camp Arawak is populated by some very questionable characters. There's camp owner Mel with an old man look and knee-high black socks that make him irresistible to teenage counselor Meg. There's head counselor Ronnie, who wears such short shorts he might as well just go around in a Speedo. Then there's the pedophile head chef Artie. The kids are almost all foul-mouthed brats who tend to be just awful to one another. And the worst of the bunch is Angela's bunkmate, Judy, a bully for the Mean Girl record books. Angela has trouble adjusting to her time at camp. She doesn't speak, she doesn't eat, and this doesn't sit well with most of her peers, so they start picking on her, leaving Ricky to angrily stand up for her on multiple occasions. Angela is able to make a connection with fellow camper Paul, but that makes her the target of more bullying. And soon enough, the people who get on Angela and Ricky's bad side start getting killed or horrifically injured. Doused with boiling water, drowned, stung by bees, slashed. While writing the script, Hiltzik envisioned the camp he knew from childhood, Camp Algonquin. He had no idea whether or not he would actually get to film there, but when he had presented the idea of making a movie on the camp property during the off-season, the owner gave him the okay. It didn't even matter what kind of movie that he was going to make. So what if it was going to be about campers and counselors being brutally murdered? Charging the production a small fee to film there was just a way to make some extra cash during the camp's downtime. Hiltzik raised a budget of $350,000. He put together a 5-week shooting schedule that would last from September through October 1982, which is why in some shots you can see fall leaves on the trees at this summer camp. He also drew up extensive storyboards, but after the first day of shooting, he had already fallen a day behind schedule. The first day of shooting was the boating accident, and filming on the water took longer than expected. so the storyboards had to be set aside, but the shoot never fell any further behind schedule. Most production would have cast older actors to play the younger characters. You know, a way to get around child labor laws. But Hiltzik wasn't interested in doing that. He wanted his kid characters to be played by actual kids, and he did a good job of finding the right actors for the roles, regardless of age. We got Jonathan Tiersten as the hilariously intense and foul Ricky, Christopher Collette as Angela's sweet but flawed love interest Paul, Catherine Kami as bitchy counselor Meg, Mike Kellen as camp owner Mel, who starts worrying about the camp getting bad publicity as the body count gets higher, Paul D'Angelo as Ronnie, Desiree Gould going way over the top as crazy Aunt Martha, Owen Hughes as the despicable Artie, Robert Earl Jones, that's the father of James Earl Jones, as Ben the cook, Alan Breton plays Frank the cop and shaved his mustache between scenes. That means that towards the end of the movie, he has a very unconvincing fake stash. Hiltzik wanted to cast a blonde as Judy and nearly gave the role to Jane Krakowski, who would be seen in National Lampoon's Vacation that same year, and is now best known for her work on 30 Rock, Ally McBeal, and Unbreakable Kimmy Schmidt. But in the end, he decided to cast the brunette Karen Fields, who made sure Judy became a girl that nightmares are made of. And as Angela, he cast 13-year-old Felissa Rose, who would still be considered a genre icon today, even if she hadn't made any other movies. That's how impactful her performance as Angela is, especially when you couple it with that ending. The viewer comes to care about Angela while watching her get picked on simply by being quiet. We cheer for Ricky when he stands up for her, even if he does need to chill a little. It's nice to see her come out of her shell while interacting with Paul, and then everything comes crashing down.
It was shocking, to say the least. It was the twist that I absolutely did not see coming.
Camp Arawak doesn't seem like a nice place to be, but that wasn't the case for the cast and crew. The production was sort of a 5-week camping trip. Parents dropped their kids off at the set and trusted Hiltzik to take care of them. Between shots, the kids had fun hanging out and playing at the campground. Felissa Rose's parents agreed to let her be involved as long as she didn't have to get naked or be shown killing anybody. Now we have to get into spoiler territory, because it is impossible to talk about Sleepaway Camp without addressing who the killer is, and that ending. Because in the end, Angela is revealed to be the killer, and during that scene, the character is also nude.
Before Usual Suspects, before Sixth Sense, before Saw, the twist that had everyone talking was it Felicia Rose and her penis. I'm sorry, spoiler alert.
Rose wasn't directly involved with the filming of any of the death scenes. When we see the killer's hands, those are Jonathan Tiersten's hands. It was fine that Rose's parents didn't want their daughter to do the killing. The director wanted to throw the viewer off by showing more masculine hands anyway. And when we see the silhouette of the killer standing in a doorway, that's also Tiersten. The kills are satisfying and often disturbing. We rarely see the killing blows being delivered. But unlike the censorship that some Friday the 13th movies had to endure, this wasn't a ratings board decision. This was by design. As makeup artist Ed French told Fangoria magazine, "If we were to shoot things in the straightforward way that they're usually done, then my work would get cut, the film would be edited, and nobody would be getting any entertainment value out of it." Still, the payoff on these murders is seeing something terrible happen. You won't necessarily lose your popcorn, but we did manage to portray a number of terrible things happening. He was especially proud of the scene where we see an arrow get shot through someone's throat when they're in the middle of speaking. French was also tasked with making the final shot work, where we see a nude Angela standing on the beach, the severed head of a victim at her feet. And everyone is shocked to see that she has a penis. To accomplish this, Hiltzik had to find a young man with a build small enough to believably double for Rose. He had to be at least 18 to legally do the nude scene, but he also had to have a narrow enough face to be able to wear a mask of Rose's face. Made from a mold that French took of her head with her mouth wide open, Rose also had to hold her mouth open for the close-ups of her that were then edited into the sequence. It's an unforgettable sight, and to this day, Rose will hold her mouth open in the same way when she takes pictures with fans. Flashbacks are used to help us understand exactly what's going on with Angela. It was the little boy who survived the family boating accident in the beginning, not the girl as we've been assuming. But crazy Aunt Martha already had a son, Ricky, and wanted a daughter, so she decided to raise little Peter Baker as a girl, Angela. It's a twist that blindsides the audience. It's shocking. It's intercut with shots of a nude, feral Angela to shock us even more. This is an ending that sticks with people for years, decades even. Most horror fans who watch Sleepaway Camp remember the first time they saw that ending. I know I certainly do.
But that final image that is, I think, seared in the brain of anyone that has seen that movie, and specifically seeing the movie and not knowing that it was coming, which I did not know was coming. Again, before the days of internet's talking and IMDb message boards or, Rotten Tomatoes, you had to discover a movie for yourself. You had to watch it and see it. And I remember not having any concept of the last 3 minutes of the movie where you're staring at a young girl holding a decapitated head with that fucking mouth open and her penis.
We 80s kids tended to start watching horror movies at a very young age. I was probably only 5 years old at the time I saw this movie, watching it with my teenage brother, and I remember my brother's vocal, shocked reaction to the ending. I didn't even know what was happening at that moment. I was too young to be able to put together all the pieces. My brother had to explain it to me.
You just gotta be firm with these kids, that's all. Let's go.
This made for a very memorable viewing experience, and on our next trip to the video store, we rented Sleepaway Camp 2. In the years since the release of Sleepaway Camp, some have labeled the film as being transphobic, although there are fans in the trans community who stand up for it. Because the horror of this moment isn't that Angela has a penis, it's that Aunt Martha is such an unfit caregiver that she raised Angela to be someone other than herself. It was Aunt Martha who made Peter a girl, told the boy to hide his own identity, to be ashamed of his own body. This is why Angela is so meek and quiet, why she doesn't swim with the other girls, why she showers at a different time, why she doesn't participate when they play sports. Every day she has to work to hide her true self, because Aunt Martha made her do this. Being forced to bottle up everything has made Angela unbalanced herself and homicidal. The reveal could have been handled more delicately, but the 80s were not a delicate time, and the extra element of Peter and Angela having a gay father probably wasn't necessary. But I don't read Sleepaway Camp as a transphobic film. Aunt Martha is the true villain in this story. Ed Belew provided a great score for the film, and then after Hiltzik has knocked us out of our seats with the ending, we get an awesome closing credits song, Angela's Theme, or Just What I've Been Looking For by Frankie Vinci, one of the all-time great horror movie end credit songs as far as I'm concerned. Sleepaway Camp had its premiere in New York City on November 18th, 1983. And even though it missed Halloween, it was still the top-grossing film in New York that weekend. It made its way to even more theaters in '84 and was very financially successful, drawing in $11 million during its theatrical run. This was plenty to lead to sequels, with Sleepaway Camp 2 and 3 being shot back-to-back, without the involvement of Hiltzik or Rose. But they weren't done with the concept. 20 years later, Hiltzik and Rose re-teamed for Return to Sleepaway Camp, a sequel that wasn't nearly as well received as the original movie, to put it lightly.
None of the other Sleepaway Camps held a candle to that, I think, because then they became redundant and followed the same formulaic thing of all the other horror movies. That movie was built around a moment that the moment was so well done and she was so good in it. It was just the perfect shot, the perfect expression, the perfect blood, the perfect prosthetic. I mean, everything about that ended. And so you're left with that shocking image seared in your brain, and that's what you talked about, and you told people you gotta go see this movie. So yeah, without that scene, I don't know if I would have loved the movie, but with that scene, it's fucking great.
As of now, Sleepaway Camp and Return to Sleepaway Camp are the only two movies that Hiltzik has ever directed. His follow-up wasn't so good, but that first movie was great.
Freddy's Nightmare, tonight on KHNL 13.
Growing up, TV, I was always a huge fan of anthologies, and way before I got into what I would consider like the more intense horror. You know, I watched Alfred Hitchcock Presents, I watched The Twilight Zone, and I think there was something that I loved about those single-serving horror stories, which mean that you could watch something briefly, 20 minutes, and get a complete, story out of it, scare.
Short stories in horror are a staple of the genre. You need only go back to H.P. Lovecraft and Edgar Allan Poe to see the power that can be contained within a quick read. Stephen King and Clive Barker would become the modern-day equivalent of this with their works such as Night Shift and The Books of Blood. The Twilight Zone and Alfred Hitchcock Presents were two significant standouts of the anthology TV genre when they aired in the middle of the last century. The anthology show was a staple across a number of genres, but it seemed particularly so in horror, suspense, and science fiction. The original scripts and shorts were a great way to tell a lot of different types of stories and keep coming back for something new. With the advent of these new forms of TV taking to the airwaves, artists and creators saw it was time to bring back anthologies in a big way. But it would be the grandfather of zombie horror who would begin this trend in the United States just before Halloween in 1983. Tales from the Dark Side would air its pilot on October 29th, 1983. I remember the commercials for this on the indie station in my hometown, and when I watched it at 8 years old, I fell in love with everything about it. In 1982, George Romero had shown the world a new take on the old horror comics of his youth with Creepshow, a film that would inspire many horror fans with its own unique way of using short stories to entertain.
Some of them were a little outrageous, some of them were fun, not all of them were scary, but they all had a morality vibe to it. And so, of course, cut to now, I'm the showrunner on the reboot of Creepshow. So it really does feel like things went full circle because I had an opportunity not only to perpetuate and continue George's legacy, but that I get to keep telling fun horror stories that are in that vein.
Creepshow, Tales from the Dark Side, both of these things I loved, and I think that it was able to hit on and do multiple storylines with different visuals and interstitials that were fun. And again, that love carried over into things like the Tales from the Crypt when it came out on the TV, or the Tales from the Dark Side TV show. It's just something cool that it was fast, it was quick, and it gave you a multitude of different types of scares and thrills.
After that film, Romero headed to TV to begin another take with Tales from the Dark Side, a series considered by many to be one of the best anthology shows of all time. Darkside's pilot would air almost an entire year before the official first season would even start. Romero would produce the series that he created along with frequent partner Richard P. Rubenstein. The first episode would be called, fittingly, Trick or Treat, written by Romero. It focuses on an old, mean-spirited man who owns all of the debt of the residents in the small town that he lives in. His power trip is so dark, instead of candy, he offers the local kids the chance to find all of the IOUs owed to him by their parents. His house is also rigged with fake ghosts and ghouls to terrify the kids away. One night, however, it's not just the kids that visit him. It would be September 30th of 1984 when the first full season of Tales from the Dark Side would begin. Over the course of 4 seasons, the series would feature episodes taken from the works of Stephen King, Clive Barker, and Robert Bloch, just to name a few. Tales from the Darkside had one of the most iconic opening sequences that anyone in my age bracket most likely remembers. The creepy, deep voice narrator states, and ends every episode with the credits rolling by. The dialogue was written by Ramiro, and the theme music was Donald Rubinstein. The series would also have a slew of notable actors throughout its run. Blondie's Debbie Harry and Christian Slater both appeared in classic episodes, and would both return for the feature film in 1990. The same year Tales from the Darkside began, a wild and strange trip would begin its journey on HBO. The Hitchhiker had a host played by Canadian actor Paige Fletcher, but the first 3 episodes had actor Nicholas Campbell in the role. The series would have a good run with 6 seasons, the last 2 of which would air on the USA Network, which is where I first saw it. Once again, a massive list of famous actors would take a ride with The Hitchhiker, with names like Brad Dourif, Gary Busey, and ironically, C. Thomas Howell. Inspired by the show's success, network TV went back to some classics in a big way in 1985, and suddenly appointment viewing was a thing for yours truly. CBS brought back The Twilight Zone for 3 seasons that year. The return of the classic didn't have a host such as Rod Serling, but would have a narrator for some of the episodes. The Twilight Zone came out swinging with its first episodes. 2 stories directed by Wes Craven and featured none other than Bruno himself, Bruce Willis. Shatterday is an unnerving and sad tale about a man who discovers his own doppelganger while slowly fading away. It's based on a story by Harlan Ellison. Over the course of its run, Twilight Zone would have excellent writers, directors, and actors as part of its lineup. Robert Downey, William Friedkin, Joe Dante, John Milius, and Tommy Lee Wallace would be joined by actors like Elliot Gould, Gary Cole, and Helen Mirren. I saw this as a child and never missed it. Another standout episode was The Shadow Man, directed by Joe Dante. It's about an entity that lives under your bed. But as the main character finds out, lots of kids have monsters under their beds. That same year, NBC would return to its classic anthology, Alfred Hitchcock Presents. It also had a pilot that aired some months before the original series run, with a feature-length version containing 4 stories. These were all hosted by Hitchcock, with resurrected intros from his original series, and now colorized. Like The Twilight Zone, these episodes would have big-name directors, including Burt Reynolds, David Chase, and Tim Burton. Writers like Robert Bloch, Ray Bradbury, and Supernatural's Jim Beaver would be some of the talented people creating the stories. The series would wind up in syndication, the land that spawned Tales from the Darkside, with 3 of its 4 seasons taking place. Also in 1985, NBC brought an original anthology series to their network, which swung for the fences. Amazing Stories came from the mind of movie god Steven Spielberg. While not specifically horror, Amazing Stories had several episodes that would cross into that genre, and a list of talent associated with it is, well, amazing. Each episode of the show was treated like a big-budget feature film. Not only was the theme music from John Williams, it would feature horror alums to direct several of the episodes. This included Tobe Hooper, Joe Dante, Tom Holland, and the original Shape himself, Nick Castle. The list of actors was just as great, with names like Weird Al Yankovic, Patrick Swayze, and John Lithgow. Sadly, it would last a short time with just 2 seasons. There were some outstanding horror elements to the show. You could ask any 40-something right now about the Robert Zemeckis episode with Christopher Lloyd as the teacher, and I'm sure they'll remember it.
I got to puppeteer started on Amazing Stories, and that was a TV series created by Steven Spielberg back in the 80s, and it was an anthology series, cool sort of sci-fi genre anthology series. And I got to work on a few episodes of that. The Miss Stardust competition, which was a bunch of aliens in a beauty pageant for aliens. And so I puppeteered on some of those aliens. And then the Christopher Lloyd episode, Go to the Head of the Class, where Christopher Lloyd's a teacher who's kind of, not the nicest. And at a certain point, his head comes off and he's running around with it, but his head's still talking.
1985 was a big year for short stories. Following the success of The Hitchhiker, HBO decided to dedicate an entire series to the works of the legendary writer Ray Bradbury, with the Ray Bradbury Theater. Bradbury would be a part of every episode, showing his office of inspiration and usually introducing the story that would be the episode's focus. Again, while not all of the stories here were horror tales, there were a number of them that fit right into the genre. The list of talent here would also be filled with some familiar faces, like Jeff Goldblum, William Shatner, and John Glover. One of my favorites is Usher 2, which starred Patrick McNee, where he builds a killer Poe-inspired Usher house to take revenge on a number of people responsible for getting rid of any sort of literature or art that would inspire the imagination. The series would only play on HBO for 2 seasons, and would then find a home on the USA Network for its final 4. In total, the Ray Bradbury Theater did an impressive 6-season run. In 1988, slasher icon Freddy Krueger got his own anthology series, which aired in syndication. Freddy's Nightmares was hosted by Robert Englund as Krueger. The first episode, directed by Tobe Hooper, focused on what led Freddy to become the man he is, with his trial and the police officer who led the mob to set him on fire. Even Robert Englund himself would direct 2 episodes. The show was weird, wacky, and wicked. Freddy would wisecrack at the beginning and end of the episodes, and sometimes even appear in the story. The show would have a who's who of actors, including Brad Pitt, yes, that happened, Jeffrey Combs, and George Lazenby. Freddy's Nightmares was a fairly big moment in the land of horror. Besides being the first slasher icon to get his own show, beating both Chucky and the upcoming Friday the 13th series, the show would have 2 specific acts for nearly every episode, and would make it 2 seasons long. At least for me, it was hard to find on local syndication, but if you could find it, as a Freddy fan, it was required viewing. That same year, as Tales from the Dark Side ended its run, its co-producer Richard P. Rubenstein brought to life Monsters. The series was all horror, and every episode would feature its own monster, giving viewers some great practical creatures to be showcased. Everyone remembers the beginning segment of the monster family eating candied critters and tuning in to Monsters with you, the viewer. The first episode aired on October 22nd, and the series would last for 3 seasons. While some episodes could be on the wackier side, other episodes of Monsters could be downright creepy. One of my favorites of this series was based on a story by Dan Simmons, which starred Will Wheaton and Matt LeBlanc, called Shave and a Haircut, 2 Bites, and showed us a new take on the vampire legend. Hollywood makeup and effects king Dick Smith was brought on as a consultant, and he's credited in every episode as such. The series, of course, had a hell of an effects master list too. Steve Johnson and the Kyoto brothers were some of the many names to help bring to life the monsters. The 80s anthology run would go out with a gloriously creepy bang in 1989, with HBO again stepping up and stepping into the Crypt. Tales from the Crypt would go back into the very deep well of the classic horror comics, much like Creepshow had at the beginning of the decade. Where quite a few of the anthology series of the 80s didn't have a significant budget, Tales from the Crypt appeared to have a healthy cash flow. With an amazing theme from Danny Elfman, the series was produced by Walter Hill, Robert Zemeckis, Joel Silver, Richard Donner, and David Giler. HBO had no issue with content at all like regular networks and syndicated TV did, so while they may have been comic book stories, they didn't have to be clean ones. Hosted by the monstrously puny Crypt Keeper, the series would run for a lucky 7 seasons, nearly making it to the end of the 90s. Thanks to the appeal to kids, because everyone loves a rotten and wisecracking corpse, the show would even have 2 cartoon spin-offs, which would also be anthology based. Tales from the Crypt Keeper, and Secrets of the Crypt Keeper's Haunted House, which would air in the 90s. There would also be 3 feature films: Demon Knight, Bordello of Blood, and Ritual. Out of all of these, I think everyone can agree that Demon Knight rules. Tales from the Crypt was a treat for horror fans, and those who grew up through most of the 80s, eating up all of the horror crumbs that we could get. The show was slick, fun, and just a bit naughty. Episodes ran the scope from messed up to hilarious, and all points in between. Donner, Zemeckis, and Hill directed the first 3 episodes, with Hill's being the first that aired. The Man Who Was Death is about an executioner who, after losing his job, becomes his own judge, jury, and executioner. It would star William Sadler in an unexpected crossover in a Crypt Keeper segment, and at one point would show up in his death costume from Bill and Ted's Bogus Journey. So he truly was the man who was death.
Norman Bates is coming home. And he's back in business. Psycho 2.
Mother! Oh, God! Mother! Blood!
John Carpenter, Wes Craven, Tobe Hooper, Sean S. Cunningham. These fine gentlemen arguably are considered the Big Four in terms of horror. Collectively, their villains in the slasher realm have not only survived the 80s, but currently remain a footprint in the pop culture zeitgeist. You can ask any person of any age who Freddy Krueger is, and they'll know, even if they haven't seen the movie. But even before the Big Four, the world had another master of suspense, the grandfather of horror, if you will, Alfred Hitchcock. Throughout his career, the man conjured up classic after classic, with thrillers like Rear Window, Vertigo, and even smaller fare like Rope. He knew how to grip a viewer and shake them to their core. Sure, these could all be considered thrillers, but in the summer of 1960, he introduced us to one of the greatest slasher villains of all time in Psycho. If you're watching this video, it's pretty safe to assume that you already know the twist of this tale of a boy and his mother. If not, the flick is over 60 years old, so let's just say that the spoiler embargo is lifted. The reveal of Norman Bates being a crazed madman is one for the ages, and no matter how many times I see it, it's just as gripping. His character was primed for another immediate sequel, but it just goes to show that you don't need to sequelize everything if the film is perfect as is. However, in 1983, Hitchcock's student Richard Franklin delivered a sequel 23 years in the making. It was 1983. Star Wars: Return of the Jedi was the movie that all the kids wanted to see. You could not escape those adorable little Ewoks. The Police had a massive hit with a song about a creepy stalker that reminded their musical subject that he'd be watching every breath you take. It was a great year for hits. As the slashtastic days of the early 1980s were winding down, we got a few tasty morsels for frights. And while we didn't have a new Jason Voorhees or Michael Myers causing havoc, the return of Norman Bates brought a whole heap of goodness to my horror-loving soul. You see, when I saw Psycho 2, I was already well aware of that deadly shower that Janet Leigh took at the creepy Bates Motel. Alfred Hitchcock's masterpiece Psycho still holds up. Whether it's the previously mentioned shower scene that made a whole generation of movie fans stink because they were afraid to take a shower, or the brilliant camera work surrounding this excellent feature, it just all works. While some may find that last lingering image of Anthony Perkins to be a bit over the top, it's become the stuff of legend. So here I am, a fan of this flick, and as well, a fan of both Psycho 2 and the Perkins-directed Psycho 3. And man, do I have a story for you. Back at my first real job in Los Angeles, I worked at a music and video store that was located right in the heart of Studio City. One day I was working at the counter and I heard a friendly voice ask if he could look at a few video games that we had on display. And that voice was incredibly familiar. Anthony Perkins was a regular customer and I had several moments to chat with him. The man was gentle and nothing like the profoundly creepy or disturbing character that he portrayed. It's something that I will always think of whenever I watch these movies. But let's get back to 1983. Having had an affinity for Mr. Norman Bates' early adventures, I was especially motivated to see a brand new Psycho. Thankfully, my parents gave me a whole lot of freedom as a young child when it came to what I'd like to watch in theaters or on cable, and yes, I was a sucker for horror flicks. Some I had to sneak and discover, but others like Psycho 2 were easily convinced that I needed to see, especially since there was a love for the first film in my household. Talk about a great introduction to the slasher film. As a massive fan of slasher flicks, I was already excited about the prospect of seeing Norman Bates get all loony again. However, Psycho 2 did something that perhaps I didn't appreciate as much as a kid, wanting a ton of gory kills. I mean, don't get me wrong, there are a couple of solid stabbings in this flick. I mean, that knife in the throat sequence is freaking fantastic. Why Norman Bates and this story offered wasn't simply an unkillable murderer like Leatherface, Michael Myers, or Jason Voorhees. In fact, in this 23 years later sequel, the mystery remains. Who actually is the killer? Who is seemingly attempting to send Norman back to the funny farm? Norman didn't go to prison or anything like that. See, he pleaded insanity and went away for a few years. When he returns, he is treated kindly by a few choice people. However, Lila Crane isn't terribly thrilled about his release. In fact, the woman who discovered Bates' mother years ago isn't going to take the murderer's newfound freedom without a fight. The Hitchcock enthusiast Australian filmmaker Richard Franklin had every intention of remaining as true as he could to the masterful original.
I think the thing that distinguishes the directors in the 80s is that they took chances. They took big risks. So not every director is going to hit it out of the park every time. But when they do, it is a singular moment.
It began with the simple structure of a cured madman returning to where he committed his heinous crimes. Considering we'd been seeing a ton of mass killers stalking nubile victims, and they just can't seem to not trip every time that they run, this unique approach was quite refreshing. After all, how would you react if your neighbor who butchered a few people returned home after a lengthy stay in a facility? It might be a tad unsettling. Aside from the legendary Anthony Perkins, this sequel offered serious movie fans one hell of an amazing cast list that included, as mentioned, the return of Vera Miles from the first film. Robert Loggia is the sympathetic Dr. Raymond who is trying to help Norman return to a non-psycho life. And then there's Dennis Franz. If you're looking to kill off a sleazy dude who turned the family-friendly Bates Motel into some hourly rental motel for travelers looking to screw around, you really can't do much better than the casting of Mr. Franz as the creepy owner. I mean, the dude screams lowlife in the best of ways. Yet as a kid, this was the movie that introduced me to Meg Tilly, and I was smitten. The actress had already caught my eye in films like Tex with Matt Dillon. More importantly, it was the silly little PG fright flick called One Dark Night that made me excited about this charming leading lady. While Meg wasn't quite as bombastic with her character choices as her incredible sister Jennifer Tilly, Meg wasn't shy about horror flicks. She rocked my world in the cheesy yet satisfying Impulse from 1984, as well as the Abel Ferrara remake of sorts, Body Snatchers. As a fan of Meg, it was disheartening to hear years later about the terrible experience that she had on set. Miss Tilly didn't watch television when she was younger, and she had very little knowledge about the importance of the original Psycho. With a little on-set friction with her director and co-star, she had avoided the premiere and didn't actually watch the film until 2021 in a live stream. I'm hopeful that she's more accepting of the terrific relationship that she shared with Mr. Perkins, and glad she ultimately liked the film. One of the most appealing moments as I revisited Psycho 2 recently is just how impressive it is to have such a mystery play out, and not in a Friday the 13th Part 5 way. Nah, we know Bates can go a little mad sometimes.
We all go a little mad sometimes.
And yes, he is allowed to go a little mad here. Still, the sympathetic relationship between him and his leading lady is surprisingly gentle and makes it easy to understand her transformation as she gets to know the guy. You also have to appreciate the dedication to preserving what Hitchcock attempted. All the bases are covered here, and if you're a fan of the original, that helps connect to the continuation. Considering that, at the time, we weren't seeing a shit ton of sequels to every single horror flick that came out, it was cool to see something that attempted to bring some class to the mayhem. And for the most part, Psycho 2 is an ambitiously smart sequel to a classic film. One that, frankly, felt a lot more respectful to Hitchcock's OG than the shot-by-shot ridiculousness of the Gus Van Sant experiment in 1998. It's strange to look back at this, as well as Psycho 3, which perhaps is a tad seedier than this one, as it's easy to see why this blossoming franchise succeeded before it was just a handful of horror villains repeatedly giving everyone a fright. Norman Bates was legendary in a unique way. You all may be aware that in addition to Leatherface, Hannibal Lecter had been inspired by the notoriously twisted mind of Ed Gein. The same is true with Norman Bates, especially the mother angle. After all, this flick inspired many a scary tale that delves into the darkness with its mommy issue leading lads. Maniac and Don't Go in the House come to mind. For all of you who perhaps are fans, and for those of you who really relish this flick as I do myself, the legend of Norman and his psycho issues have transcended to all forms of entertainment. Every damn year, I look forward to the spooktacular Halloween Horror Nights in Hollywood, California, and when I pass the Bates Motel, it's a joy to celebrate the Bates legacy. I get especially excited at the photo op on the steps of the house and Norman occasionally chasing the studio tram with his trusty butcher knife. Since Psycho 2, we've had made-for-cable sequels and a pretty terrific series starring the incredible Vera Farmiga. And like most horror icons, I doubt we are done with Norman. There are many ways that this iconic character can return, yet personally, it always comes down to the brilliance of what Anthony Perkins brought to the role. It's very tricky for an actor to balance sympathy with psychotic tendencies. Yet, especially in this first sequel, the man expertly creates a sense of frustration and a desire to be better. And as he begins to head down to Crazy Town, you feel for the guy. One particular moment that really emphasizes this is a softer one while Norman is comforted by Mary. It was a scene that Mr. Perkins requested screenwriter Tom Holland add to give Norman something more than just the creep factor, and it works. Considering that Mr. Holland brought us both Fright Night and Child's Play, it is no surprise that he was able to add a few additional layers to an already solid script. Horror has always survived. Why? Well, it's a great way to deal with your fears and nightmares. Norman Bates is evil personified in a way that we rarely see, without getting trashy or overtly violent. Norman had issues, but instead of turning him into a cartoonish villain, the talent behind Psycho 2 managed to create an effective thriller that both celebrates the classic feature and adds some of the modern horror tropes that we all love. And while the violence isn't over the top, there's still good fun to be had. Richard Franklin went on to do a couple of decent features, including Cloak and Dagger, Link, and perhaps a less than stellar sequel to FX. Yet I still appreciate the care that he put into creating such a solid follow-up to a film that really didn't need it. While Psycho 2 isn't exactly on par with some of the more bombastic and wild flicks that came out in the 80s, it was a breath of fresh air for fans who were curious about what had happened to Norman Bates all those years back. Psycho 2 may not reach the heights of the brilliance of Hitchcock's take of motherly love, but it certainly can stand proud as a fine example of a legacy sequel before they were cool. In fact, I wish that other modern horror flicks would take an approach like Psycho 2. In the modern age of blockbusters and the like, this sequel remains something unique and special for those willing to discover it.